Vampire too? The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want. After a few days, Arthur West returned to his lonely house in Hythe. Jonathan and Mina did not say anything to Arthur about their fears, but they read the newspaper carefully every day. Then one morning, Jonathan saw these words: "The beautiful lady of Hythe." The young mothers of Hythe are very afraid. Something very strange is happening in this little town by the sea. Some young children have disappeared from their homes. When they were found, the children were safe, but they all told the same strange story. They had met a beautiful lady with long black hair. She had smiled at them and kissed them. All the children were found again in the old churchyard on the hill. They were very pale, and they all had small red marks on their throats. Who had taken them there? Was it the beautiful lady? What had made the marks on the children's necks? There have been no answers to these questions. "Is Lucy the beautiful lady?" Mina asked. "Are the little children her first victims?" "I'm afraid they are," Jonathan answered. "I will send a telegram to Van Helsing at once. He is the only man who can help us, and poor Lucy too." Professor Van Helsing left Amsterdam as soon as he received the telegram. He went at once to the Harkers' home in London. Mina welcomed the old man with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said. "We do not have much time," Van Helsing answered. "I will do all I can to help." That night, Jonathan told the professor about Castle Dracula. The professor asked many questions. "You were lucky to get away from Castle Dracula," the professor said at last. "Vampires have terrible powers. Count Dracula is the most powerful of them all." "And I helped him to come to England," Jonathan whispered. "What does he plan to do here? Can we stop him?" "Let me tell you all I know about vampires," Van Helsing answered. "I have studied their history and read many books about them. Some vampires are hundreds of years old. They live on blood, which they take from living people. But vampires stay alive after they have been buried. Their victims die when they have lost all their blood. Then they become vampires too." "That is what happened to poor Lucy," Mina said sadly. "How can we help her? Is there anything we can do?" "We have to do 3 things to stop the vampire," Van Helsing replied. "First, we must open Lucy's coffin. Then we must hammer a sharp piece of wood through her heart. Lastly, her head must be cut off. Then she can rest forever." "Dear Lucy, how terrible," Mina said quietly. "How can we tell poor Arthur?" "We must go to Hythe at once, Mina," the old professor said. "We must help Lucy as quickly as we can. We all loved her. We are the only ones who can help her." "I shall be happy to help," Jonathan said quietly. "After we have helped Lucy, we must fight the Count himself," the professor said. "No one in England is safe until the greatest vampire of all is destroyed." The 3 friends left immediately for Hythe. They told Arthur that Lucy had become a vampire. At first he was very angry, but Jonathan told Arthur what had happened at Castle Dracula. Then Arthur knew that their terrible story was true. Arthur, Jonathan, and Van Helsing went to the churchyard late that night. Lucy West had been buried in the family vault in the churchyard. The professor was carrying a large bag. Arthur opened the vault with his key. The 3 men stood quietly round Lucy's coffin. "Look carefully," the professor said. "The vault has not been opened since Lucy's funeral, has it? Now watch." Then, with a long piece of iron, Van Helsing began to open Lucy's coffin. "There, he said as he lifted the lid. At first, Arthur did not want to look. Lucy had been dead for nearly 2 weeks. Then he gave a terrible cry. "My God! The coffin is empty!" he shouted. "Where is my wife?" "I can answer that," Jonathan said quietly. "Lucy needs blood. She is looking for another victim." "It is true," Van Helsing said. "Let us wait in the churchyard for Lucy to come back." They left the vault, and Arthur locked it again. Van Helsing led them to a dark part of the churchyard. They waited. The time passed very slowly. Then, in the moonlight, they saw something white move towards Lucy's vault. Arthur gave a cry and stepped forward. "My God, it is Lucy!" he shouted. The thing turned its head and looked straight at them. The moon was very bright, and the 3 friends could see everything clearly. What they saw filled them with fear. Yes, it was Lucy. Her face and long dark hair looked the same, but the eyes shone with a terrible red light. Blood was running from her red lips onto her white dress. She smiled, and they could see her sharp white teeth. "Arthur, my love, come to me," she whispered. She held out her hands and walked towards him. "Come to me now, and never, never leave me." Arthur took another step forward. Lucy opened out her arms to hold him. Van Helsing ran in front of Arthur and held up a large cross. When Lucy saw the cross, she stopped smiling. Her face became cruel and angry. She made a noise like an animal and ran towards the vault. It was shut and locked, but the vampire disappeared inside. "Oh, God! Was that terrible thing my Lucy?" Arthur cried. "That is not the dear woman you loved," Van Helsing told him. "It is the vampire that is using her body. But if we are strong, we can help Lucy to rest peacefully. Give me my bag, Jonathan." They entered the vault again. It was almost dawn. When Van Helsing opened the coffin, they saw the vampire. Her eyes were open, and she smiled at them. It was a terrible smile. Van Helsing opened his bag. He took out a long, sharp stake and a hammer. Then he looked at Arthur. "I shall hold the stake and point it at her heart," the professor said. "Then, as we pray, hammer it down." With a last look at the thing in the coffin, Arthur raised the hammer. He brought it down, once, twice, many times. Terrible screams came from the vampire's blood-covered lips. The white dress became red as the stake went into Lucy's body. They all prayed. At last, the thing in the coffin stopped moving. Arthur dropped the hammer and almost fainted. "Look," Van Helsing said. "Now she is at peace." There, in the coffin, lay Lucy. She was dead and at peace. All the blood had gone, and there was a beautiful smile on her face. "Now you can kiss your wife," Van Helsing said. Arthur kissed Lucy once on the lips. Then he turned and left the vault. Van Helsing and Jonathan worked together. They cut off Lucy's head. Then they closed the coffin lid and hammered it down. When they left the vault, it was daylight. Birds were singing, and the air was warm. "We have begun our work," Van Helsing said to Jonathan and Arthur, "but we have not finished it. Now we must find Count Dracula. We must destroy him forever." The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want. After they had left the vault, the friends slept for several hours. Then, later in the day, they met to make their plans. "We are all in danger," Van Helsing said. "Dracula must know that he has enemies in England. He will soon find out what we are doing. Then he will attack us." "Why don't we attack him first?" Arthur cried. We must go to his house together. Where is his house, Jonathan?" "I can't remember," Jonathan replied slowly. "It's very strange. I think Dracula has made me forget. All the papers about his house are in my office in London."
"Then let us all go back to London quickly," said Van Helsing. "We must find out where Dracula is hiding. It will be safer if we are all together. The vampire is very powerful."
They went to London, and Jonathan hurried to his office. But he could not find the papers. They had all been taken. He returned home at once. He told the others what had happened.
"Dracula has taken the papers," Van Helsing said. "He knows he is in danger. He knows we are his enemies. But vampires have no power during daylight. In daylight, Dracula rests in one of the boxes from Transylvania. They must be in his house."
"But where is his house?" Mina cried. The old professor thought for a moment. Then he looked at Jonathan carefully.
"If you agree, I shall hypnotize you," he said. "Then you may remember where Dracula's house is."
"Yes, I agree," Jonathan said. "Do what you can, Professor. I am ready." Van Helsing sat opposite Jonathan and spoke to him quietly. The young man's eyes closed. He began to breathe more slowly.
"Count Dracula has a house near London. Where is it, Jonathan?" the professor asked.
Jonathan answered in a slow, clear voice. "The Count is living to the east of London," he said. "His house is very big and very old. There is a high wall round it."
"How did you get there, Jonathan?" asked Van Helsing.
"The nearest railway station is about a mile away from the house."
"What is the name of the station, Jonathan?" Van Helsing asked.
"It is difficult to remember. There is a mist in front of my eyes. Now the mist is going. The name is Purfleet. The mist is coming back, a golden mist. I can see red eyes. They are looking for me."
"Wake up, Jonathan," the professor said quickly.
Jonathan opened his eyes.
"You are in danger," Van Helsing said. "Dracula knew what I was doing. We do not have much time." "What shall we do?" Arthur asked. "We must get into Dracula's house and look for the boxes of earth," Van Helsing replied. "You must stay here, Mina. Don't leave the house. Dracula is not far away. Remember what happened to Lucy."
"We cannot leave Mina here on her own," Jonathan cried.
"She will be safe," the professor said. "No vampire can enter a house unless he is invited in. Lucy walked in her sleep, and Dracula met her in the churchyard. Stay in the house, Mina, and you will be safe."
The three men left the Harker's house in the afternoon. The things they needed were in their bags. They went by train. When they reached Purfleet Station, the professor asked a few questions. A man at the station was able to answer them. A tall, dark stranger had bought a big house not far from the station. Later, 50 huge boxes had been sent to the house. The stranger was living there alone. The three friends were sure that the stranger was Dracula. Very soon they were on the road to the house. As they walked, they became more and more tired. At last they reached the old house, but the daylight had almost gone. Van Helsing looked at his friends. "It is dark. We are late," he said. "Dracula will have left the house. While he is away, we will destroy his resting places." The high wall of the garden was broken in one place. They were able to climb it easily. The garden was silent and empty. The house was dark. At the back of the house they found a broken window. They were soon inside. The old house was full of dust. The air smelt unpleasant, and it was very cold. Every room was empty. Then, at the end of a long passage, they found a large wooden door. The key was in the lock, and Van Helsing turned it slowly. There was a terrible smell that reminded Jonathan of Castle Dracula.
"This place smells of blood,"
Arthur West whispered. As he held up his lamp, rats ran away from the light. Some steps went down to the old chapel. There, on the cold, wet stones, were the wooden boxes.
"Those are the boxes I saw in Castle Dracula," Jonathan said quietly. "We must work quickly," the professor said, opening his bag. "Dracula must not find us here. Inside every box we will place some holy bread. Then the vampire will be in our power."
The men worked for many hours. One by one the boxes were opened. Then holy bread was placed on the earth inside. The lids were hammered down. The two young men worked together. Old Van Helsing stood by the open door at the top of the steps. He held a cross in his hand. Jonathan and Arthur had one more box to open. Suddenly Van Helsing gave a cry.
"The Count! The Count!"
he shouted down to them.
"The vampire's coming back! We have no more time! Leave the last box and follow me!"
One box was left unopened. Jonathan and Arthur ran up the stone steps and after the professor. As they reached the broken window, they heard a terrible cry. They turned quickly. Count Dracula was coming towards them. His face was white and angry. His eyes shone with red fire. When the vampire saw Jonathan, he jumped at him like a wild animal. But Van Helsing stood in front of Jonathan and held up his cross. Dracula stepped back.
"You cannot stop me," he cried out. "I am Dracula. I have lived and fought my enemies for hundreds of years. I have fought armies. How can 3 men stop me now?"
Suddenly the house was full of strange mist. The 3 friends got out of the window and ran across the garden. They found the broken part of the wall and climbed over. In the road, the air was clear. The moonlight shone on the men's white faces.
"Come," said Van Helsing. "We must get back to Mina. She may be in danger."
The 3 friends hurried to the little station. They caught a train to London. When they reached Jonathan's house, it was quiet. Jonathan unlocked the front door, and the 3 men went upstairs to their own bedrooms. Jonathan opened his door quietly, and then he gave a terrible cry. His friends ran into the room after him. The bedroom window was wide open, and moonlight was shining into the room. Mina was on the balcony, and a dark shape was leaning over her. It was Count Dracula. One of his hands held the back of Mina's neck, the other held down her hands. But the vampire was not drinking Mina's blood. No, it was more terrible than that. Dracula was holding Mina's face to a long cut on his chest. He was making her drink his blood. The vampire turned his head. His eyes burned with a terrible red light. Blood was dripping from his red lips and long white teeth. The vampire had already taken his meal of blood. Dracula gave a cry of anger, but Van Helsing was ready for him. The old doctor held his cross up high. A cloud covered the moon. It was suddenly dark. When the moonlight shone again, Dracula had gone. A little golden dust moved over the balcony. Poor Mina was almost mad with fear. When she saw Jonathan, she began to cry and cry. Van Helsing carried Mina back to the bed. Then he washed the blood from her face and neck.
"My dear Mina," the old man said, "you are safe now. Can you tell us what happened?"
"Oh, Jonathan, why did you leave me?" Mina cried.
"I thought you were safe," Jonathan answered as he held his wife's hands.
"I was asleep," Mina said. "I was dreaming. I saw a cloud of golden dust. I saw eyes burning with red fire. Something woke me. It was the sound of a child crying. When I got up, I saw something moving in the garden. I opened the window and walked out onto the balcony. Then suddenly he was standing beside me. I saw his red eyes, his cruel mouth, and his long white teeth. I knew it was Count Dracula. He smiled and said, "Nothing can help you now. You are in my power." Mina covered her face with her hands. "Then he put his lips to my throat and drank my blood," she whispered. "I could not stop him. And now I have drunk his blood. I am a vampire too."
"No, no!"
Jonathan cried. "It is the truth," Mina replied. "I have drunk the Count's blood, and I am in his power. I must do what he wants, even if I harm you, my husband." Then Mina looked at Van Helsing with tears in her eyes. "The vampire has won," she said.
"No!"
Van Helsing cried.
"He is afraid, I am sure of it. He cannot stay in England now. He will use the last box to return to his own country. Sleep now, Mina. You must rest."
But Mina went on speaking. "I have drunk the Count's blood, and I am in his power," she said. "But perhaps we can use this power to destroy him. Hypnotize me, Professor, before dawn. I think I can tell you what the vampire plans to do." Van Helsing sat down beside Mina and moved his hand before her face. Her eyes closed.
"Where is Count Dracula? What does he plan to do?" Van Helsing asked.
"It is dark," Mina replied. Her voice was slow and clear. "I can hear moving water. Oh, the vampire's power is strong. But I hear a ship and men shouting. The ship is ready to leave. There is a mist. Darkness. I cannot tell you any more." In a few minutes, Mina had opened her eyes. "We have won," Jonathan told her. "The vampire is leaving England. We are safe now." But Professor Van Helsing shook his head sadly.
"Have you forgotten? Mina has drunk the vampire's blood. He has drunk hers. If Mina dies before Dracula is destroyed, she will be a vampire forever."
The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want. Count Dracula's plan had failed. The vampire was returning to his own country. In Transylvania, he would be safe. If the vampire reached Castle Dracula, he could rest and grow strong again. And while he lived, Mina was in terrible danger. Count Dracula had to be destroyed before he reached his castle. Arthur and Jonathan went to the port of London the next day. They found that a ship called the Queen Catherine had left for Varna. Varna was a port on the Black Sea. Dracula had travelled from Varna in July. When it was dark, a tall man had carried a huge wooden box onto the Queen Catherine. The man was Count Dracula. A thick mist had covered the ship before it sailed, and Dracula was in the box. The three men began to make their plans at once. Mina was resting in her room.
"Vampires cannot cross water without help," the professor explained. "But Dracula is travelling by ship because it is easier. He will not have to move his box until the ship reaches land. When the ship reaches Varna, Dracula will wait for darkness. Then he will carry the box from the ship. Later, the box, with the Count inside, will be taken to Castle Dracula. There, the vampire will be safe." "Then we must follow him," Arthur cried. "We must—"
Van Helsing held up his hand.
"Before we decide what to do," he said, "I have something to tell you. Mina must not know our plans."
"Why not?" Jonathan cried angrily. "Dracula has harmed her most of all."
"But the vampire has power over Mina," the professor replied. "Perhaps he knows what she is thinking. Anything we tell her, he will know."
No one spoke. Van Helsing and Arthur looked at their friend sadly. "You are right," Jonathan said at last. "I will not tell Mina anything."
"Then let us follow Dracula," Arthur said. "I have money. We could hire a small, fast ship and—" "No, we must follow Dracula by land," Van Helsing replied. "He will make the ship go quickly. But the ship will take 2 weeks to reach Varna. By land, we can get there in a few days."
"So we shall be waiting for him when he reaches Varna," Jonathan said.
"No, not you, Jonathan," Van Helsing said. "You must stay here and look after Mina."
As he spoke, the door opened. Mina stood there. Her face was pale. "No one will stay here to look after me," she said. "I am going with you."
"You will be in great danger if you come with us," the professor said. "The nearer you are to Dracula—"
"I know the danger, Professor," Mina replied. "If Dracula calls me to him, I shall have to go. But you can hypnotize me. Then I can tell you where the Count is." The professor smiled.
"You are right, dear Mina," he said.
Mina held Jonathan's hand and looked at her friends. "Every day Dracula has more power over me," Mina said. "If his power becomes too strong, you must kill me." At last the three men agreed. "Thank you," Mina said quietly. "Remember, if I become a vampire, I shall be your enemy too." In the second week of October, the four friends began their journey across Europe. They took the fastest trains, and in a few days they were in Varna. Professor Van Helsing hypnotized Mina every day. He hypnotized her before dawn and before darkness came. Dracula's power was not as strong then. Mina always said the same words. "Everything is dark. I can hear the wind. I hear the sound of moving water." So the friends knew that Dracula had not left the ship. They stayed in Varna waiting for news. More than a week passed. Every day Arthur went to the port. He asked if the Queen Catherine had arrived. Then, at last, news came. When Arthur told the others, his face was white. "The Queen Catherine arrived at Galatz at 1 o'clock today," he said. "My God, what shall we do?" Jonathan cried. "Where is Galatz?" Mina looked at her map. "Galatz is a port on the river Danube," she said. "It is more than 200 kilometers away." "We must get a ship," Arthur said. But Jonathan did not agree. "I think we should go by train," he said. "What will Dracula do?" Mina asked slowly. "Will he go to Castle Dracula by water or by land? It is nearly sunset," she went on. "Professor, hypnotize me. I shall tell you what I can." Van Helsing did as Mina asked. At first she could not answer his questions, but at last she spoke. "I hear the sound of water. The water is moving fast. I hear birds singing. It is dark, dark. I cannot tell you any more. His power is too strong." The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want. The friends took 2 days to reach Galatz. They were nearer to Dracula now. Mina was pale and ill. Sometimes she could not answer Van Helsing's questions. The professor took Mina to a hotel to rest. Arthur and Jonathan tried to get news of Dracula. They soon returned. Dracula's box was on a fast boat. The vampire was travelling up the river Seruth. The river Seruth went high up into the Carpathian Mountains. Castle Dracula was 20 kilometers from the river. "We must stop Dracula before he reaches the castle," Van Helsing told them. "In his tomb, the vampire will be safe, and then Mina will be in his power forever." "We must go up the river after him," Jonathan said quickly. "You and Arthur must do that," the professor replied. "Mina and I will go by land to Castle Dracula. We will get there before the vampire. I will put holy bread in Dracula's tomb." On the 23rd of October, Mina and Van Helsing went by train to Veresti. At Veresti, the professor bought a small carriage and 4 fast horses. It was winter, and it was very cold. Wolves were near, and they howled day and night. Professor Van Helsing hypnotized Mina every day. She always said the same words. "It is dark. It is dark. I can hear fast-moving water." Mina slept all day, and Van Helsing could not wake her. But as soon as night came, she woke up. The professor was afraid. Mina was pale and thin. Her face was changing. She was becoming more and more like a vampire. Would Mina die before Dracula could be destroyed? When they crossed the high mountains, snow was falling. At Bistritz, Van Helsing bought new horses. They reached the Borgo Pass early in the afternoon. On the right was the narrow road to Castle Dracula. The tall mountains were covered with snow. The strong wind moved the snow in the air. The howling wolves were closer now. Had Dracula sent them? The old professor was not afraid. He drove up the narrow road until it was dark. That night, Mina was very excited. Her eyes shone brightly, but she would not eat. Every day Dracula's power was stronger. The professor had made a fire. He took some of the holy bread and broke it into pieces. Then he placed the pieces in a circle on the ground around Mina. Mina was watching Van Helsing carefully. She did not move. Her face went white. "Come closer to the fire," the professor said. Mina stood up, walked a few steps, and stopped. She could not move out of the circle. Van Helsing covered Mina and himself with thick cloaks. Wolves howled, but Mina and Van Helsing were safe inside the circle. The snow went on falling. It moved round and round in the wind, and then there was mist and snow. As the mist moved in the wind, it changed into 3 beautiful women. They were the 3 vampires that Jonathan had seen in Castle Dracula. They laughed and called to Mina from outside the circle.
"Come, sister, come!" they cried. "You are like us now!"
But Mina turned away, and the vampires could not enter the circle. They called to Mina all night, but when the dawn came, the beautiful women changed back into mist. Mina slept. In the morning, the 4 horses were dead. Van Helsing made the fire as big as he could. He left Mina sleeping inside the circle. Then the old professor started to walk up the narrow road to Castle Dracula. The snow was very deep, and the wind blew into the professor's face. His bag was heavy. He was cold and afraid. He felt the vampire's power around him. Castle Dracula looked black against the white mountains. Van Helsing went on. At last he reached the terrible building. When he came to the chapel door, it was wide open. But the air inside smelled terrible, and he could not breathe. The chapel was full of old tombs. One tomb was bigger than the others. On it was written the name Dracula. When Van Helsing opened the tomb, he saw it was empty. The professor opened his bag. He took out some holy bread. He put the bread inside the tomb and closed the lid. The vampire would never enter it again. Then Van Helsing found the tombs of the 3 women vampires. They looked very beautiful. Their eyes were open, and they smiled at him. The old professor looked at them for a moment, but then he remembered Lucy. He took sharp stakes and hammered them through the vampires' hearts. How they screamed as he hammered down the stakes. But when the professor cut off their heads, the vampires changed. There was nothing in the tombs but dust. Then Van Helsing left that terrible place. Slowly he walked down the road to Mina. "My husband is near," Mina called out. "Quickly, I must go to Jonathan." The snow had stopped falling. The air was clear and cold. It was almost sunset, and the sun was red in the sky. To the north, Castle Dracula was a great black shape on the side of the mountain. Far below them, the river Seruth was black against the snow. They could see a narrow, winding road which went up the side of the mountain. Along this road, a cart was moving quickly. On the cart was a huge wooden box. Dracula was returning to his castle. Professor Van Helsing put his arm around Mina, but she was not afraid. "Look," she whispered. Behind the cart were 2 men on horses. "It is Jonathan and Arthur," Mina cried. And they are moving faster than the cart.
The sun is going down behind the mountains, Van Helsing said. Dracula must be destroyed before the light has gone.
Jonathan and Arthur were galloping faster and faster. Their shadows were long and black on the snow. At last the two friends reached the cart. The driver tried to hit Arthur, but Jonathan pulled the man down from the cart. They fought together for a moment, and then the man ran off, shouting with fear. The black shadows had grown longer now. The light had almost gone. Was there time to destroy the vampire? Jonathan jumped onto the cart. He pushed the huge wooden box down onto the snow. The box broke open. There lay Count Dracula. The last light of the sun shone onto the Count's cruel face. Jonathan's long, sharp stake was above Dracula's heart. As the stake went through the vampire's body, Dracula gave a terrible cry. Then Arthur's knife cut through the vampire's throat. There was silence. But there was no blood on the snow. Count Dracula's body was a heap of dust. Mina ran down the road, and Jonathan took his dear wife in his arms. The vampire was dead. The years of blood and fear were over. The picture sequence from the cinema has finished. You can look at it once more if you want.